It's common to hear complaints about modern Pokemon games and how much better the older games were compared to the new ones, but what if I told you that every Pokemon game has their flaws, even when they were the newest game? In this video, we'll discuss the worst thing about each main series game, starting with Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. I guess you could say that Red and Blue started the series and turned Pokemon into somewhat of a smash hit, so they had to do a lot right. This was our first introduction to Pokemon, and although a lot has changed from us starting with this and now being here, the core formula remains the same. Catch Pokemon, battle with said Pokemon, defeat the final boss, and that's pretty much it. With that being said though, Pokemon Red and Blue aren't without their fair share of flaws. I'm sure you've heard a ton about the issues with Red and Blue on my channel alone and elsewhere, so I won't dwell too much on these games, but the biggest flaw with them has to be the glitches and overall lack of polish. While some glitches such as the Missing No glitch and the Glitch City glitches are cool, as you have to go far out of your way to even encounter them, with my favorite being this infinite spinning glitch from the Safari Zone, there are still many glitches and oversights you'd encounter in just normal gameplay. The most common ones are the fact that every single move has a 1 in 256 chance of just missing because of a coding error. Some moves like Focus Energy just don't work and in fact have the opposite effect of lowering your critical hit ratio. Moves like Jump Kick and High Jump Kick only deal 1 point of recoil damage if they miss, and not the 1/8 damage they're supposed to. Psychic types are just immune to ghost types instead of being weak to them, and many more. While all the things I listed seem pretty minor, as they are, when you have so many small things like this, it definitely adds up. Some games are easier to find flaws in, I'm looking at you Nintendo Switch Pokemon games, while other games are harder, and some Pokemon games share similar flaws, especially ones that are based off of the same region. Pokemon Yellow version is extremely similar to Pokemon Red and Blue, however they have a bit more polish, the Pokemon sprites look better, actually like Pokemon even, and some of the glitches and oversights from Pokemon Red and Blue were fixed. Not all of them though, and considering that Pokemon Yellow was essentially the 4th time they released the same game in a row between the original Japanese Red and Green, Japanese Blue version which was released shortly after and fixed some issues with Red and Green, the international releases of Red and Blue which fixed even more issues, then Yellow version, it's surprising that more issues weren't fixed. And that's the main issue with Yellow version. It just didn't improve upon Pokemon Red and Blue enough to fully warrant another new game in the Kanto region. I understand the main reason for Yellow version even existing was for marketing and to capitalize off the success of the Pokemon anime, since most people recognize a game with Pikachu on it rather than a game with one of a lizard, a tortoise, and whatever Venusaur is supposed to be. Still, it seems to be a common complaint for fan-written reviews from when Pokemon Yellow version first came out in 1999. I'll be referencing some of these fan-written reviews throughout the video for games that I didn't think have obvious flaws or flaws that are different than the games they're based on, like Yellow from Red and Blue, and some of these reviews are just absolute gold. And speaking of gold, how about Pokemon Gold and Silver? One of the more polarizing entries in the series. For a long time, it seemed like Gold and Silver were beloved, flawless Pokemon games among the community due to the expansive post-game, including a condensed version of the Kanto region, the introduction of shiny Pokemon, and the introduction of other cool mechanics like breeding, held items, and my favorite new addition, Jumpluff. Look at this knitted Jumpluff keychain that I got at TwitchCon. How adorable is that? I've noticed in the last year or so a shift in the perception of Gold and Silver, with the most common issue I see thrown around being the level gaps. It's fine for the first 4 gym badges or so, with each gym leader gradually increasing in level to fit with the other story elements like Team Rocket battles or rival fights. Then around the time you're supposed to get your 5th gym badge, things get a little weird. The whole point of you going to Cianwood City is to pick up the medicine for the sick Ampharos that Jasmine is tending to. Jasmine is the gym leader of Olivine City, but you can't fight her until you get the medicine for her. While you're picking it up in Cianwood City, you could also fight Chuck's gym and steal this poor guy's Shuckle, but you don't have to do that just yet. But let's say you go in the order that the badge case says and you battle Chuck 5th, then Jasmine after helping out her Ampharos. You can do both of these gym battles back to back with no trainer battles between them, aside from any trainers you might have missed in the lighthouse on your first time going through it. Jasmine doesn't even have any gym trainers in her gym, and her ace is 5 levels above Chuck's ace, which is pretty high. Then it gets even worse from there. After defeating Jasmine, next you're supposed to go towards Mahogany Town to fight Price's gym. Before this gym opens up though, you have a side quest at the Lake of Rage with the Red Gyarados and Team Rocket, and you have to clear out their base. There's a fair bit of grunts and Rocket executives to clear out, and they have pretty low level Pokemon. Most are around level 20 or so, with the highest being the executives level 24. It is a bit weird to have them be over 10 levels below the previous gym leader's ace Pokemon, but maybe this is designed to be easy to give you a bit more EXP before Price's gym, right? If Jasmine's gym had level 35 as her ace Pokemon, then Price has to have Pokemon between level 35 and 40 to make it a bit harder. Well, no, despite Price being the 7th gym leader, he has lower level Pokemon than Jasmine, the 6th gym leader. Price's ace Piloswine is only level 31, so it would make way more sense if you battle him and do the Team Rocket HQ before battling Jasmine, but that's not exactly how it works. The game does allow you to battle the 5th through 7th gym leader in any order you want to. However, if you're playing through the game without knowing this and just battle the gyms in the order that you find them in, it'll feel like they're out of order when they're actually not out of order. While this is an issue for Gold and Silver, you might think surely they'd fix it with Pokemon Crystal version, right? All they have to do is lower Jasmine's Pokemon a few levels, then increase the levels of Team Rocket and their HQ and Price's gym a bit too, but no, they didn't do that and they just left it the same. While you can argue that the biggest issue with Crystal is just the level gaps like it was with Pokemon Gold and Silver, I want to highlight another issue with Crystal that the original game shared as well, which seems to be much easier to fix. Like with every new generation, new Pokemon are introduced. Generation 2 introduced 100 brand new Pokemon, but for some reason you can only get some of them in Kanto or super late in the game in Johto. Many of the Pokemon you'd find while collecting all 8 gym badges are just Kanto Pokemon, so I don't know why so many new Pokemon are locked until late in the game, or why they're even in the post-game. Why is Houndour, a Generation 2 Johto Pokemon, only found on Route 7, which is in Kanto version in Crystal? The same goes for Slugma and Murkrow, despite Murkrow being featured by some of the Team Rocket admins. Then there's other Pokemon, like Gligar, Skarmory, and Sneasel, that are only found super late in the game, meaning you'll have a harder time getting Generation 2 Pokemon in a Generation 2 game. I don't see people talk about this issue as much as the level gap issue, but I think it's equally as bad for Gold, Silver, and Crystal. One issue I don't talk about too often is how a lot of people who watch my videos aren't even subscribed, so be sure to subscribe if you enjoy the content, and also leave a like, as that one click helps me out tremendously, or just don't if you don't want to, I guess. Now with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, we leave the Game Boy era of Pokemon and enter the advanced generation. There are a couple of issues that come to mind here, despite Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire being one of my most played Pokemon games. The first issue I thought of was the classic, too much water, and while the water routes can get annoying or confusing, there's another issue that doesn't get talked about too much that we highlighted on the channel before. It was more prevalent when Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were the newest Pokemon games, and that's the inability to get all 386 Pokemon in Ruby and Sapphire. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire can't connect with the Generation 1 or Generation 2 Pokemon games, which makes getting older Pokemon from those generations much more difficult, and upon release of Ruby and Sapphire, many of the Generation 1 Pokemon and most of the Generation 2 Pokemon were just unobtainable. They were still in the game, and with future releases like Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, Fire Red and Leaf Green, and Emerald version, it made completing the full Hoenn Pokédex much easier, although you needed like 6 games to do so. After Ruby and Sapphire, they released Fire Red and Leaf Green for the Game Boy Advance, which did help a lot with the Generation 3 Pokédex issue. These games are remakes of the original Generation 1 Pokemon games, of course, with updated mechanics to make them feel more modern, which still holds up pretty well even to this day. The Gen 1 glitches were fixed, and the game is much more polished overall, but the main issue I have with it is that it's Kanto. Again, the issue isn't necessarily just that we're back in Kanto again for 3 generations in a row, but how they tried to keep the game too close to the original Pokemon Red and Blue experience. Newer Pokemon weren't obtainable until the post-game, and you couldn't even trade for Generation 2 or 3 Pokemon until getting the National Pokédex. Seeing as Johto Pokemon were found in Kanto in Gold and Silver, which takes place only 2 years after the events of Red and Blue, why not leave Houndour on Route 7 for Fire Red and Leaf Green, and maybe put some Remoraid's in the water as well? Fire Red and Leaf Green also felt like a step backwards when it comes to some mechanics. There's no day-night cycle, meaning it is impossible to evolve Eevee into Espeon or Umbreon, and even if there was a day-night cycle, they'd probably just block the evolution, much like how Golbat gets blocked from evolving to Crobat until the post-game of Fire Red and Leaf Green. It's weird to me how they modernized the Kanto experience in some regards by changing up some Pokemon's movesets and adding some new mechanics, then disregarding other new things like the day-night cycle and blocking some evolutions. I think if these games had a day-night cycle with daily events like we saw in Gold and Silver, they'd be much better, but overall the biggest issue I have with them is how they tried to restrict you to the original Red and Blue experience as much as possible, instead of incorporating all of the newer elements and just incorporating some of them. Now, for Pokemon Emerald. Emerald version is another game that is seen as one of the best in the series among Pokemon fans due to how it improves upon Ruby and Sapphire. There are more double battles in the main story, gym leaders have better and upgraded teams, and the story makes more sense incorporating both Team Aqua and Team Magma, while even adding a few extra Evil Team events, mainly for Team Magma. It's a more polished third version than Crystal version was, and I had a hard time finding an exact flaw. The Pokedex issue isn't as much of an issue with Emerald version as it was in the last games, as Emerald was the last game released in the Gen 3 cycle, although you do still technically need all of these games to complete the Pokedex in Emerald version if you wanted to. So I turned to the internet to see what people in 2005 were saying about Emerald version, what issues they had with it. We're going to GameFAQs, of course, and a lot of Emerald reviews just say how it's just a repeat of Ruby and Sapphire, which is true, I guess. I don't like using this as an issue for Emerald because it can apply to any third version like Yellow or Crystal version before it, but this is the third time they've done it, so by now fatigue is starting to set in a bit more. Looking at other negative reviews, I see a ton of them saying similar things, and there's also this one titled, "I support Pokemon Euthanasia." I don't know what that's about, and I don't think I want to know what that one is about. I think that's enough about Pokemon Emerald version. Let's pick up our DSs and talk about Pokemon Diamond and Pearl next. Diamond and Pearl had a lot to like, with them being the first DS Pokemon games. They're mostly regarded as one of the better entries in this series, but one issue that you'll face, especially when playing it on original hardware, is how slow they are. I don't mean the story is slow, but the game just runs slower than other Pokemon games, making battles feel longer, the frame rate feels like it drops sometimes, and there's some screen tearing while running. Diamond and Pearl just weren't fully optimized for the Nintendo DS, which is an issue that I hope Game Freak doesn't have with future entries in the series. Following Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, we have Pokemon Platinum. The fourth time they made an upgraded fourth version of the previous games, and much like what they did with Emerald version, they made Platinum stand alone from Diamond and Pearl a bit more so than Yellow version or Crystal did before it, to the games they're originally based on. The gym order was changed a bit in Platinum version to make it flow better. The gym leaders even have different teams, some of which make a lot more sense, like Volcaner's team actually having multiple electric types on his team, and the game runs a bit smoother overall. I would say that Platinum version is the most polished Pokemon game out there, as there's just so much to offer, and it's the game that I had the most trouble when it came to pinpointing the biggest issue it has. If I turn to online reviews from 2009, many of them say how it's just Diamond and Pearl, again, which is true, and how it feels too recycled. It's hard for me to find any other glaring issues with Platinum version since they did such a great job at fixing some of the flaws that Diamond and Pearl had, and even expanded upon them a little bit. I guess we can say that HMs are an issue too, since you need quite a few of them to beat the game and go through the Sinnoh region, and some of them are just useless in battle like Defog, but that issue will also exist in Diamond and Pearl. Maybe I'm being biased since Platinum is one of my favorites, but overall I would still say that it has the fewest issues out of any Pokemon game released thus far. Check this out though, I finally got my shiny Torchic. I did 2,048 encounters over 1 weekend alone, and I wasn't keeping track until then. I don't want to think about how many encounters I did overall. So now, speaking of Platinum version, we can go back to my original shiny hunting scenario that I was doing, which is soft resetting for a shiny Turtwig in Pokemon Platinum version. I started this late March. As soon as I got back from PAX East, I got a copy of Japanese Platinum version. Eventually I reset my English copy, and here we are, soft resetting for a shiny Turtwig. Barry, you're annoying me. I actually have a TikTok series, my TikTok's linked in the description, where I just do like one reset a day or so. I was doing Alpha Sapphire for a while, but I finally got my Torchic. So now we're back going for Turtwig, and it wouldn't be one of my videos without having a random reset in it, I guess, right chat? Let's see what we get. Barry, you can't have a shiny in Platinum version, but I can have a shiny, and it's gonna be... It's not shiny. Well, there's always next time. Now for another remake game, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Seeing how Platinum released right before them, and Platinum fixed the gym order issue that Diamond and Pearl had, maybe Heart Gold and Soul Silver will do the same for Crystal version. Well, no, they didn't. The Johto gym leaders still have the same Pokemon with the same levels from the original Gold and Silver games. They feature a Battle Frontier now, although it's the exact same one as it was in Platinum version. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense since they look the exact same, but they exist in 2 different regions at the same time, but whatever. While I look back pretty fondly at Heart Gold and Soul Silver due to all of the fun things they added like following Pokemon and more shiny hunting methods, the biggest issue I have with them is that they didn't do much to improve upon Crystal version outside of incorporating new mechanics like abilities. This would have been a great time for them to change around the gym levels, especially since they added some new Team Rocket executives in Team Rocket battles, but overall I still say that Heart Gold and Soul Silver are just improvements upon Crystal. We just have to nitpick and find some issues for the sake of this video. And although Platinum isn't technically a remake game and Heart Gold and Soul Silver is, I still would have liked to see if Heart Gold and Soul Silver incorporated some of the things that Platinum did to Diamond and Pearl, like of course, changing around the gym order. Now for Pokemon Black and White. I feel like these games have the opposite effect that Gold and Silver have. While Gold and Silver were beloved at first and slowly got more disliked over time amongst the community, Pokemon Black and White weren't too liked upon release, but nowadays people look back at Generation 5 as being one of the best generations in all of Pokemon. Black and White did something very unique in the main story in that until you become the champion, the only Pokemon you can encounter are the new Generation 5 Pokemon that they introduced. This was to make Pokemon Black and White feel more like Red and Blue, where if you were to play them as a new Pokemon fan or a longtime fan of the series, you'd encounter all new Pokemon that you hadn't seen before. It was a cool idea in theory, however many Pokemon fans and people in general prefer familiarity and like seeing some older Pokemon that they already know while playing through a new Pokemon game. That's probably why they never did something like this again, and it was not very well received upon the initial release. As time went on though, and people began to be more familiar with the Unelvan Pokemon, it became less of an issue, especially with the original Pokemon Black and White games approaching their 15th anniversary, which sure makes me feel old. Now for Pokemon Black and White 2. Another enhanced version like we saw with Platinum or Crystal version, but this time there's 2 of them. There are some differences between each version as we see with most paired Pokemon game releases, but unlike other enhanced versions, Black and White 2 are proper sequels to Pokemon Black and White. They have a different story from Black and White, different characters, some different gym leaders and towns, and although they take place in the same Unova region as the base games, they feel like very different games from Pokemon Black and White. This is the Generation 5 experience someone who wants to use older Pokemon will prefer, since Unova now has more older Pokemon in the main story before beating the game, and the gym leaders even have some older Pokemon now too to reflect that. I would consider Pokemon Black and White 2 to be a top 3 Pokemon game in the series, and much like with Platinum and Emerald version, I had a pretty hard time finding one issue to highlight for this video. Looking back at fan reviews from 2012, some people complain that it's the same thing as Black and White, which I don't necessarily agree with. These are some of the more different enhanced games released for Pokemon, even if some of the same towns exist in Black and White 2 as the originals. Another complaint I saw was people saying how it's just the same Pokemon experience again. By this point, Pokemon has been out for over 16 years and remained mostly the same way, especially since the updated mechanics in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. They didn't really take many risks with Pokemon Black and White 2 and haven't taken many risks or expanded upon the Pokemon formula in a while, which is something that will change with the 3DS era of Pokemon releasing shortly after Black and White 2. The first main series Pokemon game on the 3DS was Pokemon X and Y released in 2013. This is where we saw Pokemon take more risks and start focusing on gimmicks, with Generation 6 big gimmick being Mega Evolution. This gave certain Pokemon a temporary in-battle evolution if they were holding the correct Mega Stone that had them change form and made them much stronger. Some Mega Evolutions changed types, and overall Megas were well received as they brought something new to the same old Pokemon formula. They played a big role in the story of Pokemon X and Y, but X and Y also marked when Pokemon started to become much easier. Pokemon is a game targeted towards children, and they're always pretty easy, but X and Y changed how the EXP share works and made it work for all Pokemon again and not just one single Pokemon, which can cause some of your Pokemon to be over-leveled, causing the rest of the game to be much easier if you're just one-shotting everything. While this is true, I don't think this is the main reason why the games are so much easier. If we look at gym leaders of Pokemon X and Y, they also only have 3 Pokemon to their name. The same was for Pokemon Black and White too, but this time we can use overpowered Mega Pokemon like Mega Charizard or Mega Lucario. This makes X and Y one of the easiest, if not the easiest Pokemon game, which is their biggest issue. They're still fun to play, but one-shotting half of the game with an overpowered Mega Lucario can get pretty boring. Following Pokemon X and Y, we saw the release of Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire in 2014, almost exactly 10 years ago. These are remakes of Ruby and Sapphire, but unlike Heart Gold and Soul Silver or even Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green, this time they adapted Hoenn to the modern era. The story is altered to include Mega Evolution, Deoxys is featured in the post-game, and overall it makes Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire feel like a proper remake of a game rather than the same exact thing over again on newer hardware. They are still pretty easy like Pokemon X and Y, as they're basically just X and Y in Hoenn, which is part of the issue. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire is a dumbed down version of Ruby and Sapphire in terms of difficulty, and it also just doesn't feature the iconic Battle Frontier from Emerald version, and instead teases us by saying it's coming soon, except it never came. Pokemon Emerald has the best Battle Frontier area in my opinion, and it's a shame that it never returned. While I think overall Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are amazing, and they did add a lot, I would have liked it if there was a little bit more, rather, mainly just the Hoenn Battle Frontier. Why did we never get that, Game Freak? Many Pokemon fans thought that following Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire they'd release an enhanced version of Pokemon X and Y, perhaps Pokemon Z or Pokemon X2 and Y2, but instead we moved to Generation 7 with Pokemon Sun and Moon. While it's no secret that Generation 7 is my least favorite generation, I can still appreciate how they tried to change the traditional Pokemon formula with island trials over gym leaders, and had a cool new gimmick in Z moves that were powerful moves a Pokemon can do if they were holding a certain Sea Crystal thanks to this cool funky watch. Sun and Moon remind me quite a bit of Yokai Watch with how they play, which at the time was a huge series in Japan. It's pretty dead now unfortunately, but I don't think it's a secret that Pokemon saw Yokai Watch as an actual threat during this era of Pokemon. I don't want to spend too much time on Generation 7 as a whole, but the biggest issue I have with it are the cutscenes and dialogue. I understand Generation 7 tries to focus more on a story compared to most other Pokemon games, but the story isn't a great story and offers up more questions than answers, especially when it comes down to the Ultra Beasts. Many of the times that you're stopped for dialogue feels pretty unnecessary too. The games also run fairly poorly, similar to Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, but they feel slower from the dialogue. Maybe I just have to play through Pokemon Sun and Moon again, which I do plan on doing anyway, and when I do that I'll stream the gameplay live on my Twitch channel, link in the description. This was probably the most predictable issue out of any game in the series, so now let's just move on. A year after Sun and Moon, they released Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Since Black 2 and White 2 are the previous enhanced versions that were released and they made a lot of changes to the base games they're based on, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon are basically the same thing as Pokemon Sun and Moon. Sure, you could say this for a lot of enhanced versions, but out of all of them, the Ultra games feel the most similar to the originals, which is worse when you consider the fact that they were released only a year after and came off Pokemon Black 2 and White 2, and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which changed a lot from the original games they were based on. With the small changes like Ultra Necrozma and the post-game additions, you can easily argue they're better than Sun and Moon. I would say that the Ultra games feel like the most unnecessary Pokemon games, as yes, they are slight upgrades over Sun and Moon, but they do still feel rather unnecessary, especially when you consider the fact that we skipped Pokemon Z version for this, and they could have just skipped this game entirely to focus on the new Pokemon games on Nintendo Switch, which released only a year after the Ultra games. In 2018, Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee were released for Nintendo Switch. These were the long-awaited Nintendo Switch Pokemon games, and unlike in the past when the first main series game on a brand new console would mark a new generation with a brand new region, the Let's Go games are still part of Generation 7 and take place in Kanto, which we've visited many times in the past. These are essentially remakes of Pokemon Yellow version with different protagonists and a different rival, and mostly follow the same exact story as Pokemon Yellow version. I know, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, especially when Red appears in the story and he was in the original Red and Blue games, but whatever. This time, unlike with Fire Red and Leaf Green, we see non-Kanto Pokemon in the Kanto region, sort of, with the Alolan forms. This was a nice touch to make the game stand aside from Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green a bit more, and on top of that we can use some Mega Pokemon as well. They did a lot of cool things with the Let's Go games, but they were ultimately made to capitalize off the success of Pokemon Go and the success of the Nintendo Switch. The Let's Go games feel more like if they made Pokemon Go into a console game rather than a mobile game. The catching system works like Pokemon Go in the Let's Go games, where you throw a Pokeball instead of battling a wild Pokemon with your Pokemon, which can be pretty annoying, and you have to catch the same species of Pokemon over and over again to get candies to make that Pokemon stronger, much like you would in Pokemon Go. Some core elements like held items and abilities were removed as well in the Let's Go games, making the gameplay much simpler and more like the Red and Blue experience. It's a weird combination of the Pokemon Go formula and the main series Pokemon, and although I'd focus on the catching system being the biggest issue, the whole Pokemon Go-ification of this game makes it feel really strange. It was very fun to play through on my first time to see the Kanto region in full 3D and HD, and although they did some good here, the catching mechanics really ruined it for me, and to be honest, I don't really feel much of a need to replay these games again, which is probably why I've only played through them like 3 times. I guess saying that I've played through a game 3 times sounds like a lot, but keep in mind that I've played through pretty much every other Pokemon game 5+ times, and that includes Scarlet and Violet. As for the first brand new Pokemon experience on the Switch, we saw Pokemon Sword and Shield in 2019. Unlike the previous couple of mainline games, Sword and Shield was more of a return to form, featuring 8 gym leaders again and a final tournament that was basically an Elite Four again with a championship battle. As much as I liked Pokemon trying out different things for the last previous games before Sword and Shield, I do appreciate a more return to form every now and then. The gimmick this time is Gigantamaxing or Dynamaxing, where Pokemon just get really big for a few turns, have powered up attacks, and some Pokemon even change form with their Gigantamax forms. It's a weird marriage between Mega Evolution and Z-moves sort of, which was rather polarizing upon release. The biggest issue by far that I see people talk about when it comes to Pokemon Sword and Shield is, of course, Dexit. This is where some Pokemon were cut from the game and were unobtainable outright. More were added back through free updates so you could transfer them over. Personally, I think the whole Dexit issue was blown a bit out of proportion since it doesn't affect the actual core gameplay when it comes to becoming a champion, but it did mean that you can't truly catch them all in Sword and Shield and have a fully complete Pokédex, which feels rather weird for a Pokemon game as the whole foundation is catching them all. After Pokemon Sword and Shield, we saw another remake game release in Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl for the Nintendo Switch. These are remakes of Diamond and Pearl, and they're remakes, alright. The game is very similar to Diamond and Pearl, which is expected, and the main addition is the Sinnoh Underground, which allows you to catch some more Pokemon that you wouldn't normally be able to find in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. The art style is this chibi style that isn't for everyone, and I find it so easy to bump into walls in this game due to how the mechanics work with moving. As in Diamond and Pearl, you could only move up, down, left, and right, then in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, you have the same map, but you can move diagonally. But other than that, it's just Pokemon Diamond and Pearl on the Switch again. There's some quality of life improvements like HMs being used from the Pokétch apps this time, but as a remake, many fans feel like it was a step down, especially compared to Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. Aura has changed a lot from their base games, while Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl didn't incorporate the Platinum changes for the Gym Order and the Gym Leaders teams. It's a Pokemon Diamond and Pearl remake alright, and although they did change the Elite Four to make it a bit harder, many fans still wish that these were Platinum remakes instead of Diamond and Pearl remakes. I wouldn't necessarily say they're bad Pokemon games, but the biggest issue that I see people saying is that they just didn't change enough from the original Diamond and Pearl games. I personally still really enjoyed Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, as I just love Generation 4 City on Switch was fantastic, but I do fully understand now the issues that other people say when it comes to wishing that this was more of a Platinum remake rather than a Diamond and Pearl remake. Then only a few months after the release of Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, Pokemon Legends Arceus was released for the Switch. Often dubbed as the Breath of the Wild of Pokemon, which isn't exactly entirely accurate, but I see why people draw comparisons to Breath of the Wild. These games take place in Hisui, which is what Sinnoh was called before it was settled and modernized, and focuses on the history of Sinnoh and, of course, the legend of Arceus. It's wildly different than any other main series game we've had, with no badges or badge equivalent, and instead a focus on exploring the wilderness and catching Pokemon. And again, as much as I do prefer a more return to form type game like Sword and Shield was, I really do like it when they take these risks like this and release different main series games. It doesn't quite feel like a main series game, but I still think it's a fantastic game overall, although it has a similar issue as the Let's Go games have, where the focus is mainly on catching. This time you do catch Pokemon in a more traditional sense, and often while playing, I found myself having to stop what I was doing to catch more Pokemon to progress the story, which was a bit tedious, as story progression is tied to Pokedex progression. I think they went a bit over the top with all of the tasks you need to do to fill out your Pokedex and progress the story, and I'm interested to see how they improve upon this formula with the next Legends game releasing soon in Pokemon Legends ZA. And finally, we have Pokemon Scarlet and Pokemon Violet, the most recent additions to this series. And look, we've been talking for like, what, 20 minutes about Pokemon, so I'll keep this one short and sweet. The biggest issue with Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is the performance. Frame drops, Pokemon and NPCs not loading in properly, the world just flickers sometimes. It's a bit of a mess, and graphically a step down from the other Switch Pokemon games, especially like the Let's Go games. Why do the Let's Go games look the best when they were the first ones released? The core is there, but the shell needed a lot of work. I do feel like these games had a lot of potential because, again, the core is there, but the shell that it's packed in just wasn't a very good shell. So that's the biggest flaw with every Pokemon game. Keep in mind that I like every Pokemon game for one reason or another, and for some games, it was hard to find an issue to talk about, and others had multiple issues that I could have talked about, and some games even shared issues. I thought about making a video about the best things in every Pokemon game first, which I still might do, but you guys seem to like it when I focus more on the bad, so I started with the bad first. And with all that out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to support the channel, or just don't. Have a great rest of your day. I'll see y'all next time, and bye-bye.